Alright, today we're going to talk about properties of rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. Oh my. Alright? All quadrilaterals. A rhombus is a parallelogram. Alright, it's a parallelogram with four congruent sides. A rectangle is a parallelogram with four right angles. Alright? And lastly, a square is a parallelogram with four congruent sides and four right angles. So all three of these are parallelograms. So not only do they have these characteristics, they have the characteristics of a parallelogram. Excuse me. So they have the characteristics of a parallelogram as well. Alright? Alright, now look in here. A quadrilateral is a rhombus if and only if it has four congruent sides. And if you remember, if and only if is a biconditional statement. It works both directions. So if you know you have a rhombus, you know the figure has four congruent sides. If you know you have a figure that has four congruent sides, you know you have a rhombus. Okay? Biconditional statement. A quadrilateral is a rectangle if and only if it has four right angles. Okay, again, biconditional statement, two-way street, works both directions. And lastly, a quadrilateral is a square if and only if it is a rhombus and a rectangle. Alright, meaning it's a rhombus, so it has four congruent sides, and, meaning it has to do both, and it's a rectangle, so it has four right angles. Alright, classify the special quadrilateral, explain your reasoning. So we look at this figure here, alright? We have these little markings, little slashes on the sides, so four congruent sides, and we have the angle of 127 degrees. So right away from this, alright, it has four congruent sides, so right away we're thinking what? We're thinking rhombus or a square, right? Now, how do you determine if it's a rhombus or if it's a square? Well, you got to look at the angle measure. Alright, that angle, 127 degrees, is not a right angle. One of the angles is not a right angle. So the rhombus is not also a square. Okay? We know it's a rhombus and a square, alright, but because the angle is not 90 degrees, therefore it's not the square. So it is a rhombus. Alright, so that's the thought process that has to go on in your mind, thinking about that figure. Okay? Please try these problems for class tomorrow, okay? For any square CDEF, is it always or sometimes true that segment CD is congruent to segment DE? Explain your reasoning. A quadrilateral has four congruent sides and four congruent angles. Classify the quadrilateral. Okay? Now, a few more characteristics. A parallelogram is a rhombus if and only if its diagonals are perpendicular. Alright, perpendicular. That symbol means perpendicular as well as I'm writing out the word perpendicular. Alright, and again, that's a biconditional statement. Alright, and in this, segment AC, which is diagonal, one of the diagonals is perpendicular to segment BD. The two diagonals are perpendicular. Alright, now next one. A parallelogram is a rhombus if and only if each diagonal bisects a pair of opposite angles. So our diagonals here, segment AC bisects angle A and bisects angle C. And then diagonal BD here bisects angle D and bisects angle B. Alright? Segment AC bisects angles BAD and angle BCD. And segment BD bisects angle ADC and angle ABC. Okay? And then the last one here, a parallelogram is a rectangle if and only if its diagonals are congruent. Alright? So it's a parallelogram, diagonals bisect each other anyways. But now because it's a rectangle, alright, what happens? Well, the diagonals are actually congruent to each other. So segment AC is congruent to segment BD. Alright? Your building a frame for painting, the measurements of the frame are shown at the right. Alright, here are the measurements, 20 inches, 16, 20, and 16. Now, the frame must be a rectangle. Alright, given the measurements in the diagram, can you assume that it is a rectangle? And explain. Alright, so first, part A. Is it a rectangle? Alright, or can we assume it's a rectangle? Yes or no? And the correct answer would be no, you cannot assume that that's a right angle with the information that's given to you. Okay, because what makes a rectangle a rectangle? Okay, if we think back, alright, what does a rectangle have? A quadrilateral is a rectangle if and only if it has 4 right angles. Do we know anything about the angles here? No. We just know the opposite sides are congruent. What does that make this? It makes it a parallelogram, right? That is a parallelogram, which may or may not be a rectangle. Alright, so with the information that's given, we cannot assume it is a rectangle. We need to know if we have right angles. Okay? Now part B, you measure the diagonals of the frame. Alright, the diagonals are about 25.6 inches. What can you conclude about the shape of the frame? Alright, and I always share this, okay, when the builders were building my house, the framers were building my house, building the walls, I personally saw them doing this, right here, part B, when they were building the walls of my house to make certain that the walls were square. That's the term that builders use, that the walls are square. Just to make sure that you have rectangles or squares, obviously in some cases, but what they're looking for is, do they have 90-degree angles? And this is what they do. Alright, they don't sit there with a builder's square and put it in the corner of the wall to see do you have a right angle. Alright, they measure the diagonals of the wall. Okay, if they're congruent, if they're the same, it is a rectangle. Okay, the two diagonals are 25.6 inches. They're congruent, okay. What can you conclude about the shape of the frame? The frame is a rectangle, alright? So, that is the lesson for today. Rhombuses, rectangles, and squares, oh my. Thank you.